So today we're going to talk about the Teton Dam collapse and what went. So the Teton Dam was located in southeastern Idaho on the Teton River. It was a 305-foot earth structure with an 853 square mile drainage site. It was federally funded. It was built by the Bureau of Reclamation, and its aim was to control spring runoff from the mountains and store water for irrigation during the hot summer. It was proposed to produce hydroelectric power as well. So the construction that was proposed in 1963 actually began in February of 1972, and the first filling began in October of 1975. Was not met without controversy from the very beginning. In September of 1971, there were multiple environmental and conservation groups who filed a lawsuit in the Idaho District Court to stop construction. Some of the things they cited were the destruction of a scenic river and how this would contribute to destruction of wildlife habitats and a trout fishery. They questioned the return on investment and if it was a worthwhile project. There was concerns with its compliance with National Environmental Policy Act, and also a lot of concerns about the geological instability of the area. Regardless, on this lawsuit, there was stalling from a lack of funding and site preparation, but the Teton Dam did begin construction and reservoir filling began in October of 1975. As we know now in retrospect, it did not end well with the Teton Dam, and disaster unfolds. The dam collapses. So it all began on June 5th of 1976. Early in the morning at 7:30, a muddy leak began to appear, and a 100-foot crack was seen in the dam. So the Bureau of Reclamation sent a team of engineers to investigate it, and ultimately they determined that the leak was minor and wasn't a cause for concern. But around 9:30, just a couple hours later, the sinkhole formed and a muddy flood of water started leaking out. And local officials did have conflict with the idea of evacuating, maybe notifying the public, but they didn't want to cause panic. So there were a couple of bulldozers that were sent to try to fix it before it got any worse. And they tried to fill it with sand, sandbags, other materials, but were ultimately unsuccessful. And two of the bulldozers actually had to be rescued from the area. Just a couple hours later, the dam was breached. A muddy flood became rapid, and the Bureau of Reclamation was forced to declare a state of emergency, and the local officials began to evacuate the surrounding communities. So by later that evening, by 8, the full extent of the breach and the emptying of the reservoir caused flooding at many times the rate of the flow of Niagara Falls. So it got up to 20 miles per hour and reached heights of 300 feet. And by this point, it pretty much became emptied out and destroyed a lot in its path. There was a lot that it left in its aftermath. 5 counties were flooded, traveled a total distance of 155 miles downstream, but it destroyed homes, businesses, farms. Unfortunately, it caused the death of 11 people. It killed 16,000 livestock, displaced over 13,000 people from their homes, and a total of $2 billion in property damage was caused. So this is just some of the wreckage that it left. You can see homes, buildings destroyed, businesses, and some of the families that were affected and forced to seek shelter in these evacuation centers. So anytime a tragedy like this happens, we have to ask ourselves what went wrong. So the Bureau of Reclamation conducted an investigation into the cause of the Teton Dam failure. They ultimately cited multiple things, including an inadequate design, that the site-specific geological conditions were not taken into consideration, so they highly underestimated the complexity of the geology, and the materials were not compacted and could not withstand the water pressure, which ultimately caused pipe erosion that led to the collapse of the dam. There's also a lack of safety controls. So the monitoring systems were not functioning. And there were, um, when there were alarms on the abnormal water flow in 14 of 17 of the monitors, the person who was watching it did not alert anybody. And ultimately, all of this was heavily influenced by the rush construction. And this had a lot to do with the bureaucracy, finances, and rushing to meet these schedule demands. So this fits the Swiss cheese model that's talked about in Human Factors. And this is when an alignment of multiple weaknesses that might not cause um, failure on their own when lined up just right and compounded cause a system failure. So in this case, there was holes in the safety net and the inadequate site investigations of the area. There was a failure to learn from early warnings. There was a lack of communication between designers and construction engineers, and ultimately systemic issues were the final hole in the Swiss cheese model, where pressures to meet scheduling and inadequate oversight ultimately caused this disaster. There's a lot to reflect on and lessons to be learned from something like this. Definitely the importance of thorough investigations and how site-specific designs can prevent disasters from happening. Proper monitoring of water seepage and flow during filling of dams. Also, the problem of lack of external reviews. If this was sent for external reviews, they might have been able to catch some of the flaws in the design and prevented this from happening. Also, the importance of implementing secondary defenses in the case of issues. But this failure did have something good that came out of it, which was the creation of the National Dam Safety Program in 1978, which included the SEED program, or the Safety Evaluation of Existing Dams, which just essentially has stricter and more thorough examinations of dams and their safety. Thank you.